Hello, Sage 230 class. I hope everyone had a Merry Christmas. Um, Before Christmas, we had completed our discussion of the Torah in the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, of course, is the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it tells the story, the fundamental story of the people of Israel. uh, Starting with the primeval history in Genesis, in which we get the story of how the world came to be the way it was, and then of Abraham and his descendants and how they went down into Egypt where they became slaves, and God's great act of liberation, setting them free from slavery, bringing them into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where they would receive God's law and a new way of life and learn how to live as the people of God, to be a priestly kingdom that represented to all of creation the way in which God intended for people to live. We looked at the Ten Commandments and as the summary of God's law, and we looked at the way in which the people of Israel from the very beginning struggled to be obedient to God. Now we are turning to the prophetic books and the story of the kings and the prophets of the people of Israel. The prophetic books are listed on your screen, and they are divided into two types: the former prophets, which are often called the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These books tell the story of the people of Israel once they came into the promised land, the land that God had promised to them, a land flowing with milk and honey. But also the story, but in these former prophets is the story of how the people of Israel failed to live according to God's law, and eventually were taken off in, either destroyed, the people of Israel, or taken off into exile in Babylon, the um, the people of Judah, and how God eventually brought them back up out of exile, back into the land, and where they built a second temple and continued to live as God's people. The latter prophets are the particular books associated with particular prophets and their messages from God. So today our goal is to really understand kingship in Israel, how they came to have a king, and the role that the prophets played in Israel and Judah. Now, when the people first came into the promised land, they did not have a king. Joshua and Judges tells the story of the people's early days living in the promised land. Joshua is the next leader after Moses. His job is to lead the people as they conquer the promised land and make it their own. Then in the early days, the judges were the ad hoc rulers who rose up during times of difficulty and challenge in the promised land. Throughout Judges, there is a process in which the people prosper. They are doing well, but their prosperity leads them to turn away from God and to disobey God. Then things begin to go badly for them, and the judges rise up to lead them back to God and lead them back to prosperity. The book of 1st and 2nd Samuel is the story of how the people of Israel came to have a king. And that's what we want to turn to now. Originally, when the people asked God for a king, it was seen not as a good thing, having a king over Israel. In fact, it was seen as a betrayal of God, that they wanted a human king rather than simply to have God as their king. And in 1 Samuel, there's a passage where the people tell Samuel, the judge at the time, the leader at the time, that they want a king like the other nations have a king, one who can lead them in battle and rule over them. And this is what God, how God responds to that request. It is seen as a betrayal of God. So I'm going to read you this short passage from 1 Samuel 8:10 through 18, so that you get the sort of picture of the danger of kingship as it is described in the scripture. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to be his chariot drivers and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and to the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flock, and you shall be his slaves, and in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." You see, in a sense, what they were choosing to do was to go back to the ways of Egypt, where the Pharaoh ruled over them and enslaved them and kept them from uh, prosperity. In the same way, they're sort of choosing to have a ruler over them other than God, who will exploit and oppress them. In choosing a king, they end up rejecting God as their ruler, is at least one of the ways of that the people of Israel and Judah saw their kings, as a sort of return to slavery. But that's not the only way that the people of Israel and Judah thought about kingship. They also saw in King David, the first and greatest king of the people of Israel, an image of true kingship, of a good king. After Samuel anointed David to be the king when he was yet a child, um, we get the famous story of David and Goliath. You probably remember the story. The young David goes out and he kills the warrior Goliath of the Philistines, the people's enemy, who is a giant, and he kills him with merely a sling and some stones. And David's famous speech in that passage, when he cries out to Goliath across the battlefield, he says, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel." And a couple things I want to point out to you. One is that David's greatest strength is that he trusts in the strength of God, not in his own strength. And he faces a great warrior who has a sword and a spear and a javelin with nothing really but his faith in God. The other thing I want to point out to you is in this short little passage, you see the word Lord, right? And it has the capital O-R-D in it, meaning this doesn't really say Lord, it says the name of God, which is, as we've learned, Yahweh. Second, I give you just a short passage from Psalm 72, a couple verses that describe what a true king, a good king, would be like. Right? And this is described as a prayer of King David to God. And it reads, "Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. Let the mountains bear prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May he defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor." See, now when we get King David, we see a new image of the king, a true king, one who is the protector of and the provider for the people, who has a special responsibility for the poor and for the needy and for those who are oppressed. Right, so we have these sort of two models of kingship presented to us in these prophetic books. One, what kings often are, which is our oppressors who oppress the people in order to enrich themselves and to bring themselves glory. Right? On the other hand, we have a model in King David of what a true king ought to be like, right? One who trusts in God and who follows God's law and rules in the way that God intends, right? Who protects justice and righteousness and has a special responsibility for the poor and for the needy and for the oppressed. And King David is in many ways the representative of this positive model of kingship. However, even King David is not perfect. And here in the story of King David, we see the creation of the prophets as those who are responsible to bring a word from God to the king when they disobey God's law or rule in a way that runs counter to God's purposes. And perhaps you all remember the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. King David falls in love with Bathsheba, who is married to Uriah. He sees her bathing on the top of a house, and he falls in love with her, and he and she have an affair, which makes her pregnant, and then King David tries to find a way to eliminate Uriah or to hide his sins, and in the end, he has Uriah killed by sending him to the front lines in a battle against the Philistines so that he can marry Bathsheba. And here I give you just a short passage from 2 Samuel 11:27 with a typo in it. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Right? King David, who had always been faithful, goes against God's law. I mean, how many of the 10 Commandments did King David break there? Do not commit adultery, do not murder, etc. And so we see the invention of the role of the prophet. God sends the prophet Nathan to King David to bring him a message. And Nathan, the prophet, tells King David a story about a man who had a wealthy man who had a huge flock of sheep, and when a guest comes to his house, he goes and he steals the one and only sheep from his poor neighbor and kills it and serves it to his guests. And Nathan asks David what he thinks of this. And David is angry and offended at the injustice of it. He wants to, as kings are meant to do, to protect the oppressed and the needy. And then Nathan says to him, "You are the man, King David. You are the one who has oppressed the poor and the needy. You have killed your soldier Uriah in order to take his wife." And then he says God's judgment upon David. He says, "For this you shall always have violence and conflict in your kingdom. You will remain king, but this child that you and Bathsheba are about to have will die, and the rest of your kingship will be one fraught with conflict and violence." And Nathan says to David, "Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight?" And this is really the role of the prophets in Israel. They come to the king and they tell the king when and how the king has gone against God's law and God's intentions, to make sure that the kings realize that they are not the ultimate rulers, but God is, and to bring words of judgment against the king and the people. This tradition continues throughout the history of the people of Israel, and we're going to look at two prophets very briefly who brought words of God to the people. First, we're going to look briefly at Amos, who is the great prophet of God's judgment. All prophets bring the judgment of God to the people, but Amos is probably the most famous one. Now, you see, when he lived, when he prophesied, 760 to 755 BCE in the kingdom of Israel. This is after Israel and Judah had separated into separate kingdoms. And he was simply a shepherd and a farmer in Judah. Now, in Israel at the time, it was a time of great prosperity and wealth and peace. And it was a time when the nobility under the king were becoming more and more wealthy, building great houses, gathering large tracts of land, and having the people work for them on that land. But it was also a time of great inequality in society. The wealthy were becoming wealthier and the poor were becoming poorer as they became increasingly oppressed under the exploitation and oppression of the ruling class. And at the edge of their consciousness was the Assyrian Empire that would, before too long, come and destroy the land of Israel altogether. Amos came and he spoke a word of judgment against the kings of Israel and the people of Israel for not following God's law, for not protecting the poor and bringing justice to the needy. And for that, he said, they would be destroyed. So I'm just going to give you a little example of that from Amos 5, verses 21 through 24. As we look at this passage, I want you to see that at the heart of this passage is that idea of ethical monotheism that I introduced you to. The notion that there is one God over the whole world and that God's law was an ethical law for how they ought to live in relation to God and to one another. The people of Israel at the time, the wealthy in particular, thought that as long as they followed the religious rituals, as long as they made the burnt offerings that were required, that would please God and God would continue to bless them and bring them prosperity. But Amos brought a different message. Amos said, brought the word from God that says, I hate, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and great grain offerings, I will not accept them. And peace offerings of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In other words, Amos is saying God doesn't care at all about the worship practices of the people of Israel, doesn't care about their feasts and their assemblies, their offerings and their religious rituals. That is all secondary to the really very most important thing, which is to have a just society where the poor are protected, the needy are provided for, and the oppressed are set free. So nothing matters to God unless justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And Amos's message is that because the people of Israel thought they could simply appease God through burnt offerings and peace offerings and religious rituals in the temple, that God would destroy them. And the Assyrians did eventually destroy them. The second prophet we're going to look at is the prophet Isaiah, probably the most important prophet in the history of Israel. And he was located in Judah after the destruction of Israel. You'll see the dates there for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. The book of Isaiah is really a compilation of prophecies across different time periods, right? First Isaiah is during the time of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires and their domination of Israel and Judah. The time when Assyria came and destroyed Israel And when Babylon came and defeated Judah and took them off into exile. Second Isaiah is the time period when the Persian Empire defeats Babylon and allows the people of Israel to return to the land, allows the people of Judah to return to the land of Palestine and rebuild the temple. And then third Isaiah is during that time when they are back in Judah and trying to understand God's will for them in that time. The passage I'm going to have us look at is a passage from 1st Isaiah chapter 1 through 39, that time of the Assyrian and Babylonian domination. And like Amos, Isaiah brought words of judgment during that period, saying that God was going to punish the people for disobedience to God and God's law, for not trusting in God alone and not living in right relationship to one another. But Isaiah also brought a word of promise, right? And the word of judgment and the word of promise almost always go together. God is going to punish the people for their sin, but then God will also renew them. God will not abandon them. God will make it possible for them to continue to be God's people. And here we see in Isaiah 9 a promise that Christians often read during this Christmas season, the promise of a Messiah. Now, the Messiah simply means anointed one. It is, and the anointed one, of course, is the king, the one who is selected to rule over the people. But here is the promise of a new kind of king, a king who's in the part of the family of David and who rules not only like David did, but better than David did, right? And so in Isaiah 9, 6 through 7, we hear these familiar words. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And look, once again, it is the name of God there, Yahweh. The zeal of Yahweh of hosts will do this. Right, so we see here, not only does Isaiah bring judgment, as a punishment for the sins of the people, but also a promise that there shall be a new king, a better king, one who will reign in peace and justice and righteousness. And it will be God doing it, not the people, right? Just as before, it is God who will deliver the people, not they themselves. Right. So to wrap up, then we see the kings and prophets. That the kings came, and there were at least two images of a king who's would oppress the people and who would gather up wealth for himself and those like him from the people and leave them in poverty and oppression. And on the other hand, a model of a king like David, who loved God and who trusted God, as David did with in his battle with Goliath, right? Um, and the prophets come in as those who bring the word of God to the king when the king goes against God's law and God's purposes, right? The prophets are those who spoke a word of God to the king of the people, and they spoke a word of judgment for violating God's law. But they also spoke a word of promise that God would deliver the people and provide a true Messiah, a true king for the people. These prophets drew on that fundamental story that shaped the lives and identities of the people, that God is a God who liberates, who sets free those who are oppressed, right? The Exodus story of being set free from slavery, who gives them a law according to which they can live as God intends for all people in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. And then this notion of a king, an anointed one, uh, who rules on behalf of God. Yet, a king who so often, like the people, strays from God's law and God's purposes and needs to be called back to it through judgment and promises. These prophets were really the source of the ethical monotheism that we associate with the Hebrew Bible and with the Jewish religion, and that was inherited by Christians. The notion that there is one God who is all powerful, who rules over all things, and this God's intention is to bless the whole creation and everyone in it, and who holds the people, therefore, to the ethical demands of God's law so that they can live in right relationship with God and with one another. At this point, I invite you to read the passages that I have assigned you related to the kings and the prophets and to do the quiz associated with them. Meanwhile, I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon.